This is our second session on minstrelsy, and in this session we'll deal with later minstrelsy, so after the Civil War, and its various transformations. And we'll see that minstrelsy undergoes a series of changes. It is, in some ways, more calcified, more made stricter in its approach to prejudice and racism, but in other ways it creates even greater excitement, even greater liberatory potential in the sense of expressing often neglected affects or emotions, especially violence and sort of increased sexuality. So in other words, what certain white audiences are getting out of later minstrelsy is a kind of catharsis, a kind of release of energies that they may deem both masculine but toxic. So this is in some ways a efflorescence of toxic masculinity that comes into play within a form of entertainment. On the other hand, it's also after the Civil War where that many black entertainers move into minstrelsy as a way of making their living. And this, of course, is a very complicated issue and one that I'm going to talk about in a podcast episode. But you can see the problem here. On the one hand, you have performance opportunities for people who don't usually get professional performance opportunities, black Americans in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. Actually, the practice goes back to the 1840s, so it goes back to just before the Civil War. On the other hand, of course, it just seems like what's happening is a kind of acquiescence to those stereotypes that this is that in a sense these performers are signing on to a negative representation of themselves. But on the other hand, what they're doing, of course, is they're putting on makeup on their own black faces. So there's a sense in which they are performing the same kind of move that the Irish performed in the early stages of minstrelsy, where the point was to demonstrate a kind of mask that could then be removed. So this is not a straightforward issue. No issue in history is straightforward, and certainly no issue dealing with racism. So let's move on. We're talking about the changing political character of minstrelsy. From the late 1820s to the early 1850s, minstrelsy often used blackface to address issues of class and to some extent to justify Irish immigrants as being truly white. Some minstrel shows even portrayed blacks as the unfortunate victims of a cruel system. Thus, many southern states outlawed minstrel performance because it was thought to be too sympathetic. Obviously, we have a different historical purview on that, but at the time it was thought to be too sympathetic or too celebratory of blackness, and therefore was outlawed in the South. But in the 1850s, the stereotypes in minstrel performance began to harden, and it became increasingly pro-slavery. And that really goes back to maybe even the 1840s with certain things that we saw with the Virginia minstrels. And, after all, Dan Emmett is the composer of Dixie, right? Away Down South in Dixie, which is a glorification of the South, including the institution of slavery. Slaves were portrayed as relatively stupid and happy within the institution of slavery, and this is, of course, the Jim Crow character that's taken even further, becoming the kind of Sambo character or even the Uncle Tom character, and we'll talk about how the Uncle Tom plays worked out. Uncle Tom Cabin plays. And then free slaves, the Northern Dandy character, or the Zip Coon character, they were portrayed as being out of their element and ultimately as being unhappy. And so one of the things that you see in later minstrel performances is the Zip Coon character becomes something of a depressive at times. One of the main composers for the Christie minstrels was, of course, Stephen Foster. He's often thought of as the father of American song or father of American popular song. You see several monikers attributed to him. And we tend to expunge the memory of Stephen Foster. We expunge the minstrel elements, but it's really in minstrelsy that he got his start. He was, as I said, the main composer for one of the most popular of the minstrel groups, the Christie minstrels. And many of his songs that are now regarded as American classics, Old Folks at Home, My Old Kentucky Home, they were all minstrel songs that had some more than just questionable lyrics. For instance, if you're curious, you can look up the original lyrics to "Oh Susanna," which were very clearly minstrel lyrics and not just an American folkish type tune. So, America's first popular composer, and very indebted to minstrelsy. In fact, one of the things that he winds up saying about minstrelsy is the following. He wrote that he sought to build up taste among refined people by making words suitable to their taste, instead of the trashy and really offensive words that belong to some songs of that order. He claimed that he wanted performers not to mock blacks, but to create sympathy for them. So here we are. This is a person who of course, is dead before late minstrelsy occurs. He died in poverty in the Bowery, and we'll talk about why that was a bit more next session. But you can see that here in the second phase of minstrelsy, what he feels he's doing, at least, is creating sympathy for blacks. He's not mocking them. Now, when you look at some of the lyrics, you may ask yourself whether or not he's being disingenuous here. But we're going to see this move over and over again, that composers write popular music in order to raise the taste and raise the level of feeling among the people, not to lower themselves to the base feeling. So this returns us to our age-old concern with mass art in general. And is mass art always a kind of leveling down? Is it always a bid for the least common denominator? Or can it be a way of engaging a true mass, a true populace, and maybe raising them up or getting them to think more critically? I don't know. Something about raising them up seems a little bit, patronizing. And yet, clearly, some patronization is what Foster is implying here. And we're going to see it again with John Philip Sousa. We'll see it again and again, this idea that the point of popular music is to ennoble the people in some fashion. So decline and transformation. During the Civil War, minstrelsy in its classic phase lost popularity, but was replaced by variety shows, musical comedies, and vaudeville, all of which employed comic styles and song types derived from minstrelsy. So minstrelsy doesn't die, it just transforms. It becomes, in a way, it moves from being a novelty act, which is what it was in its earliest phase, to being another form of entertainment that was sort of to the side, one of many genres of entertainment, which is what it was in its second phase, to what it becomes in its late phase, which is really just American popular entertainment. The jokes and the approach to song, all of that becomes so identified with the American that it just suffuses popular culture. And so people don't look at most of these shows anymore as being minstrel shows per se. They look at it as just American entertainment, right? So in other words, it's gone underground in a sense. It's become just part of the roots of how we think of humor and entertainment and fun as operating. So the blackface tradition doesn't die. Many films, including the very first feature-length film to include synchronized sound, which is The Jazz Singer, and I do want you to know that date, 1927. It's a very important moment in the history of film and in the history of music. And this starred Al Jolson, and it employed actors in blackface. Al Jolson plays a minstrel in that movie. Other films feature black actors playing stereotypical roles derived from minstrelsy. For instance, Bill Bojangles Robinson in his films with child star Shirley Temple, or the even more blatant minstrel act of Step and Fetch It, who's in several films and was very successful. There are even Bugs Bunny and Mickey Mouse cartoons that feature blackface and derogatory racial stereotypes. Some people feel that these minstrel roles survive to the present day. Some argue that Jar Jar Binks is a modern Step and Fetch It. Others argue that certain popular figures like Flavor Flav are modern minstrels. You could take this for, what it's worth to you. You may agree with this, you may not. The point is that certain elements of these minstrel characterizations carry on. Now, we might think that those elements can carry on without their racist baggage, or we might not. But the point is that things don't just disappear because they become inconvenient to us, or because we would rather not see them anymore. Whenever you hear Turkey in the Straw, as I mentioned before, that's the original version of that is the Zip Coon song. It's grounded in minstrelsy. This is an ad card for a minstrel show, and so a late minstrel show, and you can see some of the obvious stereotypes built into this, the exaggerated lips and the eyes in both characters. You see that they're both sort of a Zip Coon character, especially the one to the right. They're playing craps, obviously, gambling. I'm not sure what the fellow's upset about, but you can also see the use of dialect there with the point is this, right, but written in the manner of dialect. And this is from 1906, so this is quite late, where there are still minstrel shows, even though, as I said, in a way, minstrel humor has just become American humor. There are still certain shows that are marked out as minstrel shows, and here you can see an advertisement for these ad cards would have just been passed out in a crowd or on a subway or whatever else in order to get people to come. Here's an illustration from a scene from Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, Harriet Beecher Stowe released this novel in 1852. As you probably know, it was given a lot of credit for creating anti-slavery sentiments in the North, making people more pro-abolitionist than they had been before. Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe at one point and said, so you're the author to blame for all this tension. He said it in an approving manner. He wasn't criticizing her. And later critics feel that maybe she's been given too much credit for inspiring the Civil War. Certainly the Civil War was a long time coming in a lot of ways. But what happens with this novel, I think, is quite interesting. As is often the case with successful novels, this one was made into a series of stage plays. Now, the way the copyright worked back then, they didn't have to necessarily get Harriet Beecher Stowe's permission. She certainly did not get script approval for these stage adaptations. Many of the stage adaptations were kind of rogue anyway. They weren't official adaptations, and they would go by various names. So, for instance, many of them were just called Eliza, who's the main female character in the novel. Some of them were just called Uncle Tom, or various titles. And part of the reason was that there are several scenes in Stowe's novel that are rife for theatrical envisioning or theatrical representation. One of the famous ones, of course, is when Eliza and her mulatto child are trying to escape from Simon Legree across a series of ice floes. So it's this moment fraught with danger. She could easily fall into the freezing water and drown and die. So a lot of the stage adaptations emphasize these moments of theatricality that are already built into the novel. But what they wind up doing is they change the tone of the novel in several ways. Let's take a look at that. So even this abolitionist novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, becomes inverted in these stage plays to become a farce about slavery and the quote-unquote happy Uncle Tom. This becomes a huge part of how people understand the South, especially after the Civil War. Something strange happens. The South is defeated, the North is victorious, and yet the North winds up looking at the South as this sort of lost mythical land, right? Part of that has to do with the things we've already been talking about in the history of minstrelsy, beginning in the 1820s and the rise of really a market society in the U.S. And people, especially people living in the North and living in cities, they feel more and more disconnected from the land. And if there was this agrarian myth that was part of not just American culture but European culture as well, and really throughout most of the world, this idea that part of what you were as a human being was your tie to the land, right? And then as you cultivate the land, you develop as a human being. Think about that word, cultivate, right? It comes from the same word that we get culture. So this idea is, as we cultivate the land, we're creating culture in ourselves, and therefore if we are alienated from the land in some fashion, then we have lost a good part of what it means to be human. We're no longer leaving our mark directly upon the soil and interacting with nature and God's plan in the way that people felt that they had been, right? That we're becoming more and more mechanical, unskilled labor, working on things that don't require a culture, don't require a cultivation of the self, but just require that we're bodies in a room performing simple tasks. And so the South becomes this kind of vision of a tie to the land in a grandiose manner, right? And of course, the South that's being idealized here is the plantation South. And part of the plantation South involves slaves. So if you want to depict slavery, especially if you're in the North and you would just abolish slavery, you just went to war for 4.5 years in order to abolish slavery, then the idea is that you have to reconfigure your notion, at least in a fabled sense, of slavery to accommodate happy slaves, to accommodate the sense in which you're in a more natural environment and people are at peace and at one with the land, whether they're slaves or masters. Of course, this is absurd, and yet this is precisely what happens with these Uncle Tom shows, and they become a way of showing the South in this idealized fashion while still having all the excitement of Eliza going over the ice floes and everything else. You can see that this also takes place in cartoons. This is from 1933, in the middle of the Depression. We have a cartoon of Mickey Mouse doing a Uncle Tom play, and it's called Mickey's Melodrama, right? So melodrama, obviously, but done in a sort of dialect. So these stereotypes, and you can see Mickey's done up in a sort of minstrel way, at least with the lips, and then he's meant to be Uncle Tom with the cane and the sort of hobbled posture and everything else, and the white there is supposed to be his white hair, and the I guess that's Goofy. I don't know. He doesn't quite look right. He's clearly the Simon Legree character here with the whip and the large villain mustache and everything else. You can see this, or at least you could when I was recording this. You can see the whole thing on YouTube if you're curious about it. I'm sure they'll pull it eventually because it's certainly not a cartoon that embodies the values that people hold anymore. And yet, keep in mind, this is 1933, right? This is well after, many decades after the end of the Civil War. Now, one of the most interesting things, as I said before, is black minstrelsy. This idea of black entertainers, black professional entertainers, taking on minstrel performances. So as the stereotypes hardened, and with the abolition of slavery that followed from the end of the Civil War in 1865, ironically, more black performers found a place for themselves as professional entertainers, specifically by performing as blackface minstrels. In the 1840s, black minstrels began to perform, notably William Henry Lane, better known as Juba, and Thomas Dilward. They were already performing. Juba was performing, for instance, in Barnum's circus, right? So he's Frank Barnum. He's already performing on the circus circuit, and Barnum, of course, an incredibly competent and successful MC and head of a circus, and he knew how to promote his performers, and so Juba did quite well in that way. By the 1850s, there were already all black minstrel troupes, but it was with the close of the Civil War that black minstrelsy became a viable career path for black musicians and actors, as well as a business opportunity for certain black entrepreneurs. And this is an important point. After the Civil War, several black people are not only the performers in minstrel shows, they own the minstrel shows, they organize them, they get the profits from them. They even organize theatrical circuits with black theater owners, so that we're talking about the beginnings, really, of a modern black professional entertainment business. It's not exactly an early version of Motown, but it's that idea of black entrepreneurship. So you can see why this is a vexed issue. On the one hand, this is good for black people. They're taking the control of their own lives in a business fashion, their own economic lives, their own representation, but that representation is filtered through these stereotypes of minstrelsy, and therefore, of course, is problematic. In most of the troops, black men, and sometimes a few women, they still wore the burnt cork with the exaggerated lips, conforming to the stereotypes of traditional minstrelsy. So they're deforming their own blackness, creating this parodistic, parody-driven version of blackness, right? Now, like I said before, you could see this as a form of performance where they're saying, well, that's not what I am. Those are exaggerations. I'm now performing these exaggerations. What I am is something more human, something more like you. And to some extent, that's how some people saw this. Other people saw it as them being what they are. And you'll see in a moment that the term original is used over and over again for these groups, that you're getting something authentic, something original. Here, for instance, you could see a advertisement for the original and only colored minstrel troupe, and this is an all African American minstrel troupe. And so you'll see this term original over and over again, right? So there's this bid for authenticity. So even though you can see the exaggerated lips, you can see that they're wearing makeup, that this is not how they would naturally look, and they're conforming to some of the. It's not quite as ridiculous as the Virginia minstrels from 1843, the various postures here, but you can see they're conforming to some of the minstrel postures for the ad. I mean, the artist is having them conform to that. And yet there's this notion that they're being advertised as being authentic, as being a alternative to the artifice of other forms of minstrelsy. Now, is this just good advertising? Is it good publicity? Is it a good way of stirring up interest? Or is it tapping into prejudice and belief that, especially among the white audiences, that what you're seeing is somehow more authentic because it's actual black people performing, and therefore you're getting a real taste of the South? Of course, they're also performing for black audiences, and that's a very complicated issue. Even before the Civil War, there were black audiences for minstrelsy, even for the white people that were performing as minstrels. And you know, we'll talk a bit more about that, but obviously we're dealing with a very complicated racial story here. Charles Hicks, a black man, and he's the one in the center there. He helped organize and manage Brooker and Clayton's Georgia minstrels. Brooker and Clayton were white people, but the minstrels, the Georgia minstrels, were an all-black troupe. And in fact, what winds up happening for a little while at least is there are a bunch of derivative groups called Virginia minstrels and a bunch of derivative groups called Georgia minstrels, where typically, although not always, so it's still confusing, but typically the Virginia minstrels were white people performing as blackface minstrels, and the Georgia minstrels were black people performing as blackface minstrels, but it's not always perfectly obvious. At any rate, Charles Hicks becomes the manager in 1865. They toured the Northeast U.S., and he wound up founding his own troupe, Hicks Georgia Minstrels, in 1866. So he only stayed with the original Georgia Minstrels for a year, and he enjoyed great success for the remainder of the decade, culminating in an 1870 trip to Germany, where he was very successful. And then the group returned in 1872 to the U.S., and it was bought out by a white manager and entrepreneur, Charles Callender, one of the very wealthy men in the minstrel business. And so Charles Hicks was able to retire a very wealthy man. And so you have this very complicated situation here. Do we look down? And this isn't a question that we're asking necessarily, but people at the time, people like Frederick Douglass, and we'll see what he has to say about all this in a moment. But Frederick Douglass asked himself over and over again, is he to look down on these black minstrels? Remember that he thought of the white minstrels, or white people engaged in black minstrelsy, as the scum of the earth, the scum of white society. So what does that make these black minstrels, right? Or are they finding a way to get by, a way to get over? Lou Johnson founded his own troupe, which went by many different names, but is often referred to as Lou Johnson's Plantation Minstrels, and sometimes Lou Johnson's Original Plantation Minstrels, because that term original keeps showing up. He founded the troupe in 1866, and he focused his career on the Midwestern section of the U.S., and here you can see an ad for the group. Notice the second sentence there. This is a slave troupe, which are artists in their different specialties with 4 end men. Look out for the parade. Seats can be secured at Miner's Bookstore. Remember that these shows always start with a parade to get people excited and get people to show up, and they'll sell tickets right after the parade. But notice that he describes it, the ad here describes it as a slave troupe, right? That's to indicate that they're actual black people. They're not currently slaves. That's not what is meant at all. First of all, by 1866, of course, there are no slaves anymore. It doesn't even necessarily mean that they're former slaves. It's just an indication that they're black. Notice also the idea of 4 end men. Remember, there are traditionally 2 end men, Tambo and Bones. Those are the guys that tell most of the jokes and so on. So the fact that there are 4 end men is meant to signify that this is a relatively large troupe, and also that somehow the more end men, the more hilarity will ensue, I suppose. So what are the responses to this? The black community and black leaders were deeply ambivalent, as I've already suggested, about the rise of black minstrels. On the one hand, it seemed like participating in the degradation of the race, right? Aren't you just confirming stereotypes that are already out there that we don't want confirmed? On the other hand, it allowed for a prevalence of black performers that would not have been possible otherwise. Moreover, blacks performing not only for black audiences, but for white ones as well. And that was thought of as an important opportunity, right? That if you can show that black people can perform, and this is a real distinction, and it's one that I think we can get lost, that can get lost for us if we're not careful. There's a huge difference between watching for a white person, let's say in New York, between watching somebody dancing the Jim Crow dance, or the original from which the Jim Crow dance was inspired, watching them do that on a street corner and watching them do it on stage are 2 very different things. And it's easy to forget that there's a difference, or to elide that difference. But there is. It's a very important difference, right? When you see someone on the street doing it, even though they're doing it as a performance, even though they're doing it so that you'll throw coins at them so that they can make extra money or whatever, there's a sense in which, oh, that's just a black person doing what a black person does, or whatever. That seems to have been the sense, at least among white people in the 1800s. When you see someone on stage, there's an element of professionalism that comes into play, that you recognize just from the fact that it's on a stage. This is a representation, that this is a show, that this is not behaving naturally. The stage grants one a certain amount of artificiality. If we were going to a theater and a fight broke out in the lobby, we might try to break up that fight because we figure it's probably not a fight, it's probably real people, right? And of course, there are stage plays that play with this whole thing, that have action out in the lobby. But for the most part, our natural instinct is to assume that the things in the lobby are real life. But when we go in the theater and we see somebody killing someone else on stage, we don't intervene because it's artificial. We recognize the stage as telling us that this is artificial. So there's a power in artificiality that's important not to forget. A black person on stage playing a black person is playing a black person, not necessarily simply being a black person. Now, there are all sorts of authenticity issues that get very confusing here, get very troubling for us, but it's still an important distinction that this is a moment where people are taking control of representation that weren't able to do so before. Now, one of the greatest thinkers about racism and about blackness at the time, of course, is Frederick Douglass, And in an article called Gavitt's Original Ethiopian Singers, where he's obviously reviewing this troupe of Gavits, and notice again the term original, and Ethiopian is just a term for blackness, right? At the time, it's very typical. It doesn't necessarily mean that they came from Ethiopia even in the long distant past. It's just an indicator of blackness. And he's writing for North Star, the liberationist paper that he often wrote for, and this is from 1849. So this is before the end. Or before the beginning even of the Civil War, a good decade or so before. He writes, partly from a love of music and partly from curiosity to see persons of color exaggerating the peculiarities of their race. So notice the artificiality is already being emphasized, exaggerating. We were induced last evening to hear these serenaders. The company is said to be composed entirely of colored people, and it may well be so. Notice he says it may well be so, right? Or it may be so. He's not saying that he knows for certain. He didn't meet them in person. He recognizes this as theatricality. We observed, however, that they too had recourse to the burnt cork and lamp black, the better to express their characters and to produce uniformity of complexion. We are not sure that our readers will approve of our mention of those persons, so strong must be their dislike of everything that seems to feed the flame of American prejudice against colored people, and in this they might be right. But we think otherwise. It is something gained when the colored man in any form can appear before a white audience, and we think that even this company, with industry, application, and proper cultivation of their taste, may yet be instrumental in removing the prejudice against our race. Look at this once again, just like we saw with Stephen Foster. There's this sense in which popular entertainment can be used to raise people, that with the proper cultivation, there's that word, cultivation, of their taste, right? And notice he's saying of their taste. So he's kind of saying in some ways, if they listen to us, if they listen to the people who are thinking about race, who are thinking about advancement, who are thinking about, at this time, still attempts at assimilation and, or at the very least, integration, right? And those two things don't have to mean the same thing. Assimilation means that one conforms to the behavioral patterns of another. Integration just means that we're together in some fashion. It doesn't have to mean assimilation. And for the most part, Douglas was more of an integrationist than an assimilationist, but again, it depends on how you read certain things and how you understand it. At any rate, what he's suggesting is that if used in the right way, this can be a powerful force in advancing the cause of black betterment, whether it's assimilationist, integrationist, or separatism. Another very important figure of this time is James Bland. And I think James Bland gives us an interesting insight into how a black composer and performer deals with society in the post-Civil War era, because he wasn't even born until 1854. So he was only born 11 years before the end of the Civil War. So his childhood was the Civil War, right? He probably he had no real conscious memories of slavery as such. And so he's a very impressive figure in a lot of ways. He was born into a middle-class family, was educated, so he was born into a class of free blacks, so he had no direct memory of slavery as a slave. He was educated at Howard University. He left college to join Haverly's Colored Minstrels, also known as the original Georgia Minstrels. A lot of groups went by that name. He was a singer, composer, and banjoist for that group. The group traveled to England in 1881, and Bland just stayed in London. He felt that the prejudice there was far less direct. It's not that it didn't exist, but he stayed in London. He stopped wearing minstrel clothes, and he had a successful career as a music hall performer and composer in England and in Germany. Germany was very interested in American music at the time, as you can see. By 1890, he was a hugely successful composer. He wrote many famous songs, including In the Evening by the Moonlight, which is the one you should listen to, Odem Golden Slippers, and then the other one you should probably listen to, Carry Me Back to Old Virginia, which for a while was the state song for Virginia. It might still be with altered lyrics, I don't remember. In total, he wrote over 700 songs, so he was very successful. He came back to the U.S. for a brief period of time and didn't do quite as well. And so I don't remember if he died in London or not, but we can look it up. At any rate, notice that part of his success, though, was by abandoning minstrelsy. He got his start in minstrelsy. Certainly when you listen to these songs that he wrote after his minstrel period, they're still very much inflected by minstrelsy, and yet part of his own journey, really, was to leave minstrelsy behind, to dress in the manner of a concert hall performer in a tuxedo and so on, and to try to transcend at least the trappings of minstrelsy, even if his music maintains some of the stylistic characteristics of it. We have a very different point of view demonstrated by the next person that we're going to talk about. And that is Ernest Hogan. Ernest Hogan's one of the most important composers that you never hear about. And part of it is because he was the popularizer of what is called the coon song. He's the first African American entertainer to produce and star in a Broadway show. This was The Oyster Man of 1907, which is pretty early in Broadway history. So he was the first to produce a Broadway show and star in it. He helped to create and perhaps even name the genre of ragtime music. Many people think that his Pamela Rag is the first true rag composition. So even before Scott Joplin, he may have been the inventor of ragtime music. And yet, you probably have never heard the name Ernest Hogan. Even if you've heard the name James Bland, you probably haven't heard of Ernest Hogan. And part of that is because, as I said, he was the popularizer, maybe the inventor of the coon song. It's hard to say who would have invented it, but the coon song is a late minstrel song where you're really running with some of the stereotypes of late minstrelsy. This song, his most famous song, was the hit All Coons Look Alike to Me, which you're going to listen to for this session. It was composed and published in 1895. The song was so popular that it was a test tune for the 1900 World Ragtime Competition in New York City. So a coon song musically is kind of a usually fast or relatively fast, up tempo, ragtime piece, right? And to get ahead of ourselves a little bit, we're going to see later that ragtime was, even though now we often play it as an up tempo genre all the time, it was not supposed to be that. It was supposed to be a medium tempo genre, as we'll see when we talk about Scott Joplin. But the coon songs tended to be a little faster. They tend to be a little more raucous, and their lyrics were very, very stereotyped, very racist, as we'll see in a moment. But this song was super popular at the turn of the century. There are several recordings of it, including the one that you'll listen to. We forget about it now in part because he, Ernest Hogan himself, rejected it on his deathbed. Many people are very critical of this genre, and for good reason. Let's take a look at the song a little bit. Coon songs were built on minstrel stereotypes, but instead of being merely indolent or lazy, coons were dishonest, and they were given to drinking, gambling, and violence. In other words, they were given to all the excesses that any person in the U.S. Might have been given to, especially men, right? So the idea of heavy drinking, gambling, and violent behavior, these are all behaviors of, again, a sort of toxic masculinity, but also a kind of heroic masculinity of the time, right? That part of the legends of the virulent man is the man who can drink and hold his liquor, can gamble and be wise to somebody cheating, and can engage in violence, properly directed. But of course, the problem with drinking, gambling, and violence is that they're very difficult to properly direct. They're, by their very nature, they're given to excess. And so there's always that danger of excess, and that's what the coon song represents. In many ways, the coons were the beginning of a tradition that continues in largely white audiences that are simultaneously repelled and attracted to violent, rebellious black men. Gangster rap is an obvious example. What would 50 Cent be without the aura of violence? And as you probably know, the early NWA records, they sold more among white teens in suburbs than they did among black teens in inner cities, at least at first. The Stagger Lee character becomes an icon of the coon mentality in country blues. So this is the sort of mythic character that arises out of blackness and out of the post-Civil War era of the dangerous black who is hyper masculine, right? And we see this in black exploitation films of the 70s, like Shaft and so on, where his violence is mostly well directed, it's mostly accurately directed, but he's still this dangerous, impulsive figure, right? Now, as I mentioned, Hogan came to regret the song. He felt that he had betrayed his race. Indeed, by the second decade of the 20th century, many black leaders decried the coon song, but the trope of the virulent and violent black anti-hero proved incredibly influential, and it's still maintained today. You can't watch a Tarantino film without seeing that, right? What is Django Unchained except a placing into a Civil War context of that very character? Here are some of the lyrics, and you can see that the lyrics are worth considering, right? In some ways, they're very stereotypical, but they're also about responses to being dismissed, right? So he says, talk about a coon having trouble. I think I have enough of my own. It's all about my Lucy Jane Stubbles, and she has caused my heart to mourn. So the song here is about a man courting a woman. He says there's another barber from Virginia in society. He's the leader of the day, and now my honey gal's gonna quit me, and she's gone and drove me away, right? And by this coon, he means me. So if you remember, this is the exact scenario of Cold Black Rose. You have a woman, a black woman, who is being not seduced exactly, but courted by two different types of black men. One is a more down-to-earth Jim Crow type character, and that's the fellow in this song. And the other is a Zip Coon type character who probably has a business and dresses more nicely, and that's the barber in this song, right? So it's the exact same situation, but as we'll see, it kind of ramps up the energy to some extent. Now notice that now we turn to the woman again. She had no excuse to turn me loose. I've been abused. I'm all confused, because these are the words that she said. So the notion that all coons look alike to me, while that is obviously playing on a white racial stereotype that all black people look alike, a stereotype that is sometimes turned around in black comedies and so on, where people say all white people look alike to me, right? This idea of the colored other, whatever that color is, being indistinguishable, everyone looking alike. That's what's being played on, but it's the black woman who's saying it in the song. That doesn't justify it. I'm not trying to pretend that it does. I'm just saying that there's a play here in representation. She says, I've got another beau, meaning the barber character, and he's just as good to me as you. He's no better. And then, of course, she says that word, right? And part of, as you'll hear when you hear Arthur Collins sing it, part of the way that the song became so successful, I think, is in the placement of that word and the energy that gets behind that word. So he's just as good to me as you ever tried to be. He spends his money free. I know we can't agree, and I don't like you know how. So this is really a song about female indifference more than anything else. At least taken literally. But when looked at in context, of course, it's about racial prejudice. It's about dismissing blacks as all being alike and therefore looking alike, and being alike and looking alike are somehow brought together in the context of this song. And then, this song isn't the greatest example of the violence of coon songs, but there are various others where that's ever more clear. The violence here is at best implicit. And again, the violence derives from Cold Black Rose. This is just an updated version of Cold Black Rose, which is one of the earliest minstrel songs in the tradition. And as I mentioned, these minstrel stereotypes and these characterizations, they continue right into the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, and really beyond that into the later 50s and 60s. It's really the 70s where the real critique of minstrelsy begins. But as we all know from the backlash in recent years, TV shows like Community, although that's a sort of tricky example, but Friends and various other shows, Scrubs, all have episodes that include blackface. So this tradition continues on, and people still mine it for humor. Probably not so much anymore, but who knows? We'll see what happens. This is, of course, the first full-length picture with sound, synchronized sound. And that's important because, as you know, the early days of film were supposedly silent film. Now, that's a misnomer because they were never silent. There were people playing music while the film was going on, but it wasn't synchronized sound. You couldn't hear the dialogue. You had to read the intertitles. You couldn't hear any music that was attached to the film as a soundtrack. It was music that was being performed alongside it. Now in 1927, you have actual synchronized sound, and that really changes everything for pictures. And it comes just in time because, of course, pictures are relatively affordable as an alternative to theater in the Depression era. And so we're only 2 years away from that by the time sound film comes along. At any rate, the very first sound film deals with minstrelsy, right? It deals with this idea of representation. And in fact, it deals with representation of a guy who is Jewish. And like the Irish, the Jews were not always thought of, people of Jewish descent were not always thought of as white, or at least as not as unproblematically white, right? And so the same idea that applied to the Irish with early minstrelsy applies to people of Jewish descent. This idea that they're putting on blackface in order to show that they are underneath it all white, because white is imagined here as being malleable, as being beyond mere identity. And I think that's an important point here, right? That throughout most of the history of the U.S., the notion of identity politics, which becomes prevalent starting really in the 1970s, late 60s, 70s, was not the idea. Even though in one sense you could say, well, identity politics were ongoing all along, it wasn't the basis of how American politics were supposed to work. It was supposed to be beyond identity. Let's continue to talk about that on the next slide. And what was beyond identity was whiteness. Whiteness was able to play with otherness, whereas others were trapped in being the others that they are. And so what I'm trying to suggest minstrelsy did for certain classes of people or certain ethnicities, like the Irish and like the people of Jewish descent, is that you were able to put on the black face to show that you could play with otherness, and therefore you were not resigned or relegated to your otherness. You were not resigned to simply being what you are on the surface, that there was something deeper to you. Now, we might even suggest that that's what's going on with actual black minstrelsy, of black people performing in minstrelsy, in blackface minstrelsy, right? That there was an attempt there to show that they were beyond and transcendent of these various forms of representation, and that therefore they were deeper than the stereotypes that were foisted upon them, and that in these situations they could play with, and that they could play as a representational bit of artifice, and that was a very important element of black minstrelsy. And you can see that even in Frederick Douglass's discussion, where he's suggesting that done in the right way, there might be something liberational or emancipatory about the use of blackface among black performers, or at least in extending the minstrel tradition, maybe not using the burnt cork necessarily. And this is, I think, a good way to end this discussion. We might lament the idea that blackface minstrelsy simply becomes American culture, and in some ways is still the root of American culture. We might want to obviate that. We might want to ignore it. We might want to say, oh, that's not true. We'd rather not look at that. Or we'd rather say, well, it is sort of true, but only in a very sort of surface sense. That it's really about the vitality of the music. That's what continues, and it's erased of its racial problems. But some of those racial problems had to do not simply with denigration, but had to do with an attempt to understand what is really a fundamental part of the United States, for better or worse, which is that this is a nation of immigrants, and some of it forced immigration. It's a nation that's founded on a great deal of racial and economic disparity, and that part of popular entertainment, part of mass culture, is coming to deal with that. And there may be healthier and less healthy ways of dealing with it. But that part of the legacy of minstrelsy that might carry on doesn't have to be as unhealthy as it has been, or at least one can hope.